Excuse me, ma'am. I'm going to need you to move. The voice was sharp, impatient, carrying the entitled tone of someone accustomed to getting their way. It cut through the soft hum of conversation in the boarding area of Gate 17. Captain Elena Shaw, 43 years old, looked up from her boarding pass. She stood at the entrance to the jetway, a worn carry-on bag slung over her shoulder. She wore simple civilian clothes, a burgundy red cardigan over a cream-colored shirt, faded jeans, and comfortable walking shoes. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, a few strands of gray visible at her temples. She said nothing, simply stepped aside to let the speaker pass. The man, mid-30s, expensive suit, leather briefcase, brushed past her without a word of thanks. He was followed by two others, both dressed in similar corporate armor, their phones pressed to their ears, their voices loud with self-importance. "No, tell them the Henderson deal closes Friday, or we walk," one barked into his phone, not bothering to lower his voice as he pushed through the line. Elena watched them disappear down the jetway, then quietly rejoined the boarding queue. The gate agent, a young woman with tired eyes, gave her an apologetic smile as she scanned Elena's boarding pass. "Thank you for your patience, ma'am. Seat 12A. Enjoy your flight." Elena nodded and made her way down the jetway, her footsteps quiet, unremarkable. Just another passenger on a Tuesday afternoon flight from Dallas to San Diego. She had been on hundreds of flights in her life. Thousands, really, if you counted the ones that mattered. The ones where the cabin wasn't pressurized with recycled air and polite announcements, but with adrenaline and the roar of afterburners. But those days were behind her now. She was retired, had been for 3 years. And most days she was fine with that. Most days. The cabin of the Boeing 737 was standard. Rows of blue seats, overhead bins already stuffed with luggage, the familiar smell of cleaning solution and stale coffee. Elena made her way down the aisle toward her window seat in row 12. She found her row and paused. A man, heavy-set, early 50s, wearing a polo shirt and khakis, was sitting in her seat. 12A. The window seat. Her seat. "Excuse me," Elena said politely. "I think you're in my seat." The man didn't look up from his phone. "I'm in 12B. Middle seat's a nightmare. You don't mind taking it, do you?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement dressed up as courtesy. Elena glanced at the empty middle seat, 12B, then back at the man. She could have insisted, could have shown him her boarding pass, explained that she had specifically chosen the window seat when she booked the flight 6 weeks ago. But she was tired. It had been a long week. A long 3 years, really. "It's fine," she said quietly, sliding into the middle seat. The man grunted something that might have been thanks and returned to his phone. His elbows splayed wide, encroaching into her space. A moment later, a young woman, early 20s, wearing yoga pants and oversized headphones, dropped into seat 12C, the aisle seat. She didn't acknowledge Elena, didn't make eye contact. She just pulled out her phone, her thumbs already flying across the screen. Elena settled into her seat, her shoulders pressed inward to avoid touching either passenger. She folded her hands in her lap and stared at the seat back in front of her. Anonymous, invisible, unremarkable. Exactly how she preferred it these days. The plane filled slowly. Passengers shuffled past, dragging rolling suitcases, clutching coffee cups, arguing over overhead bin space. The usual chaos of commercial air travel. Elena closed her eyes and let the noise wash over her. She was good at this, at shutting out the world, at finding stillness in chaos. It was a skill she had honed over years of pre-flight briefings, of sitting in cockpits while mechanics shouted and engines screamed, of waiting in ready rooms while the world outside burned. The announcement came over the intercom, smooth and rehearsed. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard. Flight 447 with service to San Diego. We'll be pushing back from the gate shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your seats are in the upright position." Elena opened her eyes and reached for her seatbelt. That's when she saw him. A young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, was walking down the aisle with his mother, his eyes wide with excitement. He was wearing a T-shirt with a fighter jet printed on the front, an F-35 Lightning II specifically. The boy stopped at Elena's row, his gaze fixed on something outside the window behind her. The tarmac, the ground crew, the distant runway. "Mom, look," he said, his voice bright with wonder. "Do you think we'll see any fighter jets?" His mother, a woman in her 30s with the exhausted but patient demeanor of someone who had answered this question 100 times before, smiled. "I don't think so, sweetie. This is a regular airport, not a military base." "But we're in Texas," the boy insisted. "There are bases everywhere." "Maybe on the way home," his mother said gently. guiding him toward their seats further back. The boy looked disappointed but obedient. As he passed, his eyes briefly met Elena's. For a fleeting second, she saw herself in him. That same hunger, that same fascination with the sky, with speed, with machines that defied gravity. She almost smiled. Almost. But then the man in 12A shifted, his elbow jabbing into her ribs, and the moment passed. The plane pushed back from the gate. The safety demonstration played on the overhead screens, the usual choreography of seat belts and oxygen masks and emergency exits that no one paid attention to. Elena watched anyway. Old habits. The engine spooled up with a low whine that grew into a roar. The aircraft began to taxi toward the runway, the tarmac rolling past the windows in a blur of gray concrete and yellow lines. The man in 12A finally looked up from his phone. "First time flying?" he asked, his tone condescending. Elena turned to him, her expression neutral. "No." "You look nervous," he said, smirking, gripping the armrest pretty tight there. Elena glanced down. Her hand was indeed resting on the armrest, but not gripping it. Her posture was relaxed, controlled. Muscle memory from years of sitting in ejection seats, hands resting lightly on controls, ready but calm. "I'm fine," she said simply. The man shrugged and returned to his phone. "Whatever you say." The young woman in 12C was oblivious, her headphones still on, her eyes glued to her screen. Elena turned her attention back to the window, or rather to the back of the man's head blocking most of her view. She could see a sliver of sky, a corner of tarmac, but not much else. The plane reached the runway. The engines roared to full power. The acceleration pressed Elena back into her seat, a sensation she had felt 1,000 times before, though usually at twice the speed and 10 times the intensity. The nose lifted. The ground fell away. They were airborne. The flight settled into the monotonous rhythm of cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers shifted, reclined their seats, pulled out laptops and books. The flight attendants emerged from the galley, pushing a cart down the aisle. Elena sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. The man in 12A had fallen asleep, his head lolling to the side, his mouth slightly open. The woman in 12C was still absorbed in her phone, occasionally giggling at whatever she was watching. Elena stared at the seat back in front of her, her mind drifting. She thought about the boy with the F-35 shirt, about his excitement, his wonder. She had been that kid once, growing up in a small town in Arizona, watching contrails streak across the desert sky, dreaming of the day she would leave her own mark on the heavens. She had made it, against the odds, against the doubters, against the men who told her she wasn't strong enough, wasn't fast enough, wasn't good enough. She had become one of the first female fighter pilots in the U.S. Air Force, had flown F-16s, then F-22s, and finally, after years of proving herself over and over again, the F-35 Lightning II. She had logged over 200 combat missions, had protected ground troops, escorted bombers, engaged enemy aircraft, had saved lives, had taken lives. She had been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal with Valor, 2 Purple Hearts, and then, 3 years ago, after a particularly brutal deployment, after watching too many friends not come home, after pushing her body and mind past every conceivable limit, she had walked away, retired, honorably, quietly, no fanfare, no ceremony, just a handshake from her commanding officer and a form to sign. She had traded the cockpit of a $100 million fighter jet for a middle seat on a commercial airliner, and most days she told herself that was okay. Most days. About 40 minutes into the flight, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez from the flight deck. We're currently cruising at 35,000 feet, and we've got smooth air ahead. Weather in San Diego's looking beautiful. 72 degrees and sunny. We should be on the ground in about 2 hours." A pause, then. "We've also been advised by air traffic control that we'll have some company for the next few minutes. If you look out the right side of the aircraft, you'll see 2 F-35 Lightning II fighter jets flying in formation with us." The cabin erupted. Passengers leaned over each other, craning their necks to see out the windows. Phones came out. Children pressed their faces to the glass. Even the flight attendants stopped mid-service to look. "Are you kidding me?" someone shouted. "This is incredible. Look at them. They're so close." The man in 12A, suddenly awake, lunged toward the window, practically climbing over Elena in his excitement. "Holy crap! Fighter jets." Elena didn't move. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm, but her heart Her heart was pounding. The woman in 12C yanked off her headphones and leaned across the aisle, her phone already recording. "Oh my God, this is insane!" The entire plane was buzzing with excitement, everyone trying to get a glimpse of the two sleek, deadly aircraft flying in perfect formation just off the right wing. Elena slowly turned her head. Through the small gap between the man's shoulder and the window frame, she could see them. Two F-35s. Gray and lethal, their lines sharp and predatory. They flew with the kind of precision that only came from hundreds of hours of training, their wingtips impossibly close, their movements synchronized. She knew those planes, knew the way they handled, the way they responded to the slightest touch, knew the sound of their engines, the feel of the stick, the view from the cockpit. She had flown them, had loved them, and for just a moment, a brief, aching moment, she missed it. The pilot's voice came back over the intercom, but this time, there was something different in his tone, something careful, respectful. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've just been informed by the flight leader of those F-35s that their presence here today is not a coincidence." The cabin fell silent. "They are here to honor one of our passengers." Every head turned, eyes scanning the cabin, searching. "We have a very special guest on board today," Captain Rodriguez continued. "Someone who doesn't advertise it, someone who doesn't ask for recognition, but someone who deserves it more than most." Elena's stomach tightened. Number: Captain Elena Shaw, United States Air Force, retired. Former F-35 pilot, over 200 combat missions, Distinguished Flying Cross, 2 Purple Hearts. The man in 12A turned slowly, his mouth hanging open. The woman in 12C stared, her phone forgotten in her hand. Every passenger within earshot was now looking at Elena, the quiet woman in the middle seat, in the burgundy cardigan, who hadn't said a word the entire flight. Elena sat perfectly still, her face a mask of calm control. But inside, her heart was hammering. "Captain Shaw," the pilot's voice continued, warm and reverent, "on behalf of everyone on this flight, and on behalf of the United States Air Force, thank you for your service. The skies we fly through today are yours, ma'am." For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Then slowly someone started clapping. Then another. Then the entire cabin erupted in applause. Elena didn't know what to do. She had been in firefights, had been shot at, had ejected from a burning aircraft at 20,000 feet, had stared down enemy pilots and surface-to-air missiles. But this public recognition, this sudden scrutiny, was somehow more terrifying. The man in 12A had tears in his eyes. I'm so sorry, ma'am. I didn't know. I took your seat. It's fine," Elena said quietly. The woman in 12C was openly crying. "You're a hero. Oh my God, you're an actual hero." Elena shook her head. "I'm just a pilot." But the applause didn't stop. It grew louder. Passengers stood. Children waved. The flight attendants, tears streaming down their faces, came over to shake her hand. And outside the window, the 2 F-35s held their formation, their wings steady, their presence a silent salute from the warriors who still flew the skies she once commanded. Elena slowly raised her right hand, not to wave, but to salute. It was instinct, muscle memory, a gesture she had made 1,000 times in ready rooms and on flight lines and in cockpits. She held the salute, her arm rigid, her face serious, her eyes locked on the 2 aircraft outside the window. And in that moment, surrounded by strangers, 35,000 feet above the earth, with her old life flying in formation beside her, Elena Shaw felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. She felt seen. The rest of the flight was a blur. Passengers came up to her one by one, thanking her, shaking her hand, asking for photos. She obliged quietly, graciously, though every instinct told her to retreat, to disappear back into anonymity. The boy with the F-35 shirt, his name was Ethan, stood in front of her seat, his eyes wide with awe. "Did you really fly those?" he asked, pointing at the jets outside the window. "I did," Elena said. "Was it scary?" Elena considered the question. "Sometimes, but it was also the greatest privilege of my life. I want to be a pilot," Ethan said earnestly. Elena looked at him, at his excitement, his determination, his unshakable belief that he could do anything. She saw herself. "Then be a pilot," she said. "Work hard. Don't let anyone tell you that you can't. And when you get there, when you're sitting in that cockpit for the first time, remember that you're not just flying for yourself. You're flying for everyone who can." Ethan nodded solemnly, as if she had just entrusted him with a sacred mission. His mother mouthed thank you over his head, tears in her eyes. When the plane landed in San Diego, the pilot made one final announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, as we taxi to the gate, you'll notice we have a special escort. Elena looked out the window. Two fire trucks, lights flashing, flanked the aircraft on either side, their water cannons raised. A water salute, reserved for the final flight of retiring pilots. For heroes coming home. The cabin erupted in cheers. Elena sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her face calm. But inside she was breaking. Not from sadness, from something else. Something she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, maybe. Or closure. When the plane finally came to a stop at the gate, the passengers didn't rush to disembark. They waited, standing in respectful silence, as Elena gathered her bag and made her way down the aisle. As she passed each row, people nodded. Some saluted. Some simply said, "Thank you." Elena nodded back, her throat too tight to speak. At the front of the cabin, Captain Rodriguez, a man in his 50s with graying hair and kind eyes, stepped out of the cockpit. He snapped to attention and saluted. "It's an honor to share the sky with you, Captain Shaw." Elena returned the salute, her eyes stinging. "The honor was mine, Captain." 3 weeks later, Elena received a letter in the mail. It was from Ethan, the boy with the F-35 shirt. Inside was a drawing, a crayon sketch of a fighter jet with a pilot in the cockpit. The pilot had brown hair and was wearing a burgundy jacket. At the bottom, in careful block letters, he had written, "Thank you for flying for us. I will fly for you." Elena pinned the drawing to her refrigerator. And for the first time in 3 years, she smiled. Stories like Elena Shaw's remind us that heroes walk among us every day, often unnoticed, often unrecognized, often sitting quietly in middle seats. If you believe in honoring their silent valor, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Veterans Past Stories for more tales that deserve to be remembered. Thank you for watching.